Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, just when you thought the COVID-19 pandemic was a once-in-a-lifetime experience with the shutdowns, mandated masks, required vaccines and passports, Bill Gates comes along and says, not so fast. Turns out COVID-19 was just one of many possible pandemics we might experience. But don't worry, you don't need to live in fear. Bill Gates has a plan.
If we make the right investments, we won't need to live in fear of another COVID. We can build a health system that is ready to stop outbreaks before they go global. Here's how it should work. Epidemiologists will detect suspicious clusters of a disease that could cause a pandemic. A global team of 3,000 disease experts managed by the WHO, called the Germ Team, will track the disease and share data and recommendations with governments. Governments and pharmaceutical companies will work together to use factories all over the world to get an unprecedented scale of diagnostics and vaccines very quickly. We'll have an agreed protocol and we'll understand how to share the results globally. Countries and the WHO will work in the best way to allocate these tools and to make sure that we have the logistics and delivery to get them to everyone who needs them. The key to be ready for a potential pandemic is to practice. And so this germ team will work with each country to do germ games, drills where you see, are you ready? Could you get the diagnostics out? So we're ready to go when we see the outbreak. Diseases are always going to spread among humans, but they don't have to become pandemics. You can read more about this in my new book, How to Prevent the Next Pandemic.
All right, well, he calls it the Germ Team, GERM, which stands for Global Epidemic Response and Mobilization Initiative. He says the team would be managed by the World Health Organization. Besides nations who contribute, the top non-government donors to the WHO are the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. But interestingly, Gavi's top donor is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So basically, it could be argued that the boss of the WHO is Bill Gates. So essentially, he'd be in charge of preventing future pandemics. Now, Gates says one of the goals of the Germ Team is to prepare a plan to stop outbreaks before they go global. Okay, well, how do you stop a virus from spreading? What did we learn during this pandemic? We've learned it's nearly impossible to do, except in one circumstance, which is to do something similar to what China has done. Extreme, aggressive, and very authoritarian lockdowns. Now, if you're lucky, you're on an island that can close off its borders to prevent the virus from coming in which case maybe life would go on somewhat as normal, minus travelers, imports, and exports. But most of the world is not an island, and viruses are invisible. So trying to stop one from spreading would require, if it's even possible at all, a total China-style lockdown. Is that the idea? Or another way to stop a virus is to create a sterilizing vaccine that actually prevents the spread, if one could even be created at all. Now, Bill Gates says big pharma and governments would work together under his plan to whip out a vaccine, just like they did for COVID. The big question is, would they work with governments to mandate them again and require people to take them or lose their jobs and lose their ability to participate in society? Would they once again neglect treatment options? Would they look into repurposing generic drugs or even into natural options like promoting a healthy lifestyle? Or would it just be that because governments and organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation heavily invested in new vaccines, that they'd once again pursue a vaccine or bust strategy? Another thing Gates says the Germ Team would do is detect suspicious clusters of diseases. They would then monitor them and do what they can to prevent them from spreading to pandemic levels. Well, that sounds like, on its surface, a good idea. Obviously, preventing a pandemic from happening at all is better than trying to deal with it once it's reached that level. But again, the question is, how do we prevent a virus from reaching pandemic levels when, first of all, the only possible but not bulletproof way to do it is through radical measures, and secondly, new viruses pop up all the time. Every few years we hear about a new virus like the bird flu or swine flu, SARS or Ebola. Now, luckily, these viruses didn't turn out to spread to levels authorities first presumed, but that's exactly the problem. If the new strategy is to implement radical measures to prevent pandemics each time a new virus is presumed to spread to pandemic levels, we could be seeing COVID-19 level measures every few years. They'd say they don't know which one is going to turn into the next COVID-19. So the only logical thing to do is to treat them all like they'd become the next COVID-19. Well, it turns out these radical measures we've been living through are exactly Bill's plan. In a blog post, Bill writes, quote, "Imagine a scenario like this. A concerning outbreak is rapidly identified by local public health agencies. If a threat is detected, governments sound the alarm and initiate public recommendations for travel, social distancing, and emergency planning. They start using the blunt tools that are already on hand, such as quarantines, antivirals that protect against almost any strain, and tests that can be performed anywhere. If this isn't sufficient, then the world's innovators immediately get to work developing new tests, treatments, and vaccines. Diagnostics, in particular, ramp up extremely fast so that large numbers of people can be tested in a short time. New drugs and vaccines are approved quickly because we've agreed ahead of time on how to run trials safely and share the results. Once they're ready to go into production, manufacturing gears up right away because factories are already in place and approved." Bill Gates goes on to say, "No one gets left behind because we've already worked out how to rapidly make enough vaccines for everyone. Everything gets where it's supposed to, when it's supposed to, because we've set up systems to get products delivered all the way to the patient. Communications about the situation are clear and avoid panic. And this all happens quickly," he says. "The goal is to contain outbreaks within the first 100 days before they ever have the chance to spread around the world. If we had stopped the COVID pandemic before 100 days, he says, we could have saved over 90% of the lives lost." Okay, now maybe that's all true that we could have spared lives from being lost from the virus, but what about the other harms the lockdowns and the depressing of the global economy has caused? People didn't get the cancer diagnosis they needed on time. Depression and suicide went through the roof, so did drug overdoses. Violent crime is way up, the list goes on. This is on top of the total neglect to find treatment options or adequately test existing ones. We're now over 700 days into this pandemic, and we're still speculating about the virus and even learning more about the vaccines. Bill talks about communication being clear to avoid panic, yet we can't even agree about the effectiveness as something as simple as a mask. So, Robbie and Brianna, what's most concerning to me is the amount of influence Bill Gates has over global health. The New York Times has reported how experts inside the public health and medical sector may disagree with Bill Gates on a variety of things, but because of his massive donations to nearly every influential health organization, you've got him at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College of London, Mayo Clinic, he's everywhere, they fear that they would lose their jobs or their entity would lose its funding. They've actually dubbed it the Bill Chill. So he's insanely influential. And I also think it's mind-boggling with that influence that Bill Gates would look at the lockdowns and the mandates and think that this worked out so well, he now wants to double down on it.
It's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. The lesson I took from this pandemic is we can never do this again. We can never again delegate so much authority to close down society, to mass society, to forcibly vaccinate society, to totally unaccountable, and even if they are theoretically accountable, they don't behave as if they're accountable, elite policymakers, epidemiologists, health officials, and then people like Bill Gates who just have a lot of money, don't have any actual formal role in the health process, but just by virtue of having bought their way into it. And you know, the kinds of people who clearly fetishize the level of authoritarian control that, for instance, a country like China has to pursue a zero COVID strategy forever, no matter how badly the people suffer.
Yeah, look, I'm very sympathetic and completely agree that Bill Gates' influence in this sector is not based on merit and is unproductive, and seems like in this context, the clip you showed, a weird money grab to sell his book, which I feel like that is not something that he needs to do to get more book royalties as one of the richest men on the planet. But I am a little concerned that some of the mistakes that have been made in the context of this pandemic, which I roundly agree with are a problem, are a reason not to try to make the system better for the next time. I think a world where we avoided some of the supply chain issues when it came to getting protective gear, when it came to getting masks. A lot of the mask confusion and the misrepresentations about the efficacy of masks was about them wanting to save, PPE for nurses and doctors. That is obviously wrong, and they should not have done that. But a plan that starts to say, oh, we can make these kinds of materials at home. We have stockpiles. We have the kind of ventilator machines and the intubation machines. We have a staff up doctors and have more hospital beds. The idea that we would be more ready next time for a pandemic that we should all remember has killed coming up on 1 million Americans, I don't think is a bad thing. And I would just push back a little against the idea that any plan to improve upon the process, just because it is being overseen by the government or in relationship to the government because of its ability to manage that kind of broad scale action, is necessarily bad.
Well, I don't think, we're not talking about avoiding any plan. It's just his plan. His plan is very specific. He says he wants to use the blunt tools that we use during this pandemic, which includes social distancing and quarantines and rapidly deploying vaccines and saying that, oh, yes, they're fine, they're adequately tested. You can't speed up long-term testing. That's just not possible. The whole point of long-term is you need to know, you need time, and you can't speed that up. So what he is saying in this book, apparently, I have not read his book, but just reading his blog post, watching his video, he is talking about using the same tactics that China is using, that China has been using, essentially. And there are a lot of people who agree with Bill Gates. And I don't know how you feel about it, Brianna, but a lot of people feel like, had we just done what China did right from the beginning, had we gone full on with lockdowns, chaining people into their homes, saying you cannot come out, and if you do come out, you have to be wearing a bubble suit. And if you're sick, you get taken away to a facility where all sick people can be together, like in an actual quarantine facility. Some people believe, had we done that, we could have stopped this pandemic. It seems like Bill Gates maybe believes that. The problem is that, again, in my lifetime alone, it's been the ones that I've just rattled off the top of my head: bird flu, swine flu, SARS-1, Ebola. That's just in my lifetime alone. I couldn't imagine doing this 5 times over as it is already by 40 years old.
But the scale of those were dramatically different than the scale of COVID. The number of deaths that have occurred under COVID is significantly different, right? And so I'm not saying that the same response would be necessary to meet those other crises. Those didn't even really result in crises. How many people were affected by swine flu? I felt like that was more of a media creation than this, which has resulted in 1 million deaths, and that number has only petered off because of this vaccine. And I very much hear some of the concerns about the vaccine effects, the new study that came out that validated people's concerns over it creating these heart problems. I full disclosure, scheduled a cardiologist appointment a couple of weeks ago because I was feeling some concerns about post-vaccine effects. But I also have to think about, and I'm looking forward to more studies coming out about what the trade-offs are. The trade-offs are between how many deaths might have occurred had the vaccine not come out. And I think I certainly encourage people to be thinking about how to mediate those effects. If we can be sent bubble suits and groceries at home so that I can voluntarily stay home and I have a check so that if I can't go into my job, I can sustain my mortgage and rent and things, I wouldn't mind that, because to me that is giving people a carrot as opposed to a stick to adopt the kind of behaviors that could prevent the spread of a disease. So I think some of those things that China did that were not coercive but persuasive might be a good idea. Other things that are more draconian and authoritarian and were forced upon the population, less so. I might push back just in that little way, but this is a fascinating take.
They can leave my bubble suit at the factory. They don't need to send me one.
Who's going to get you that bubble suit? Who's going to make it for you? Who's going to deliver your groceries? There's people that still have to operate in an underground, second-class, society. So, hopefully we don't have to do this again. That's just my ultimate point.
Please.
But Bill Gates
no.
being so highly influential, I don't know if this is the last of all of this that we've seen. So,
all right. Well, thank you very much, Kim, and we'll be back in just a minute with more Rising.